Hey, I'm meteorologist Chris Bianchi. I've been gone in Florida covering Hurricane Ian. Obviously, they needed some of the extra hands. Now, while where I'm sitting here in Tampa, it was mostly a bit of a glancing blow for us here. We did see some winds up to about 75 miles an hour. Out this window here, pretty large tree came on down. In fact, a couple of trees on this property, according to the general manager here, fell on down during the storm. Again, those winds were hurricane force. The rain was pretty minimal here, though, only picked about 2-3 inches worth of rain, which is no big deal here in Florida. Further east in Orlando, they picked up more than the foot worth of rain, some spots closer to about 16-17 inches. Here in Tampa, mostly a glancing blow. That said, as you've seen some of the devastating images and some of the kind of apocalyptic views about 100 miles to my south in Cape Coral, Punta Gorda, and Fort Myers, obviously a very different situation in parts of Lee and Collier and Charlotte counties, the southwest corner of Florida. That's the part of the state that was really just utterly devastated by Hurricane Ian. Maximum sustained winds there at 150 miles an hour. Saw a 12-foot plus storm surge inundate much of that area, and in some cases over a foot of rain as well. So just a horrible situation. We're certainly thinking about those impacted by this devastating hurricane, really in that part of the state. But even here, again, as I mentioned, in Tampa, it was no joke, despite the fact that they certainly here in Tampa were spared the worst of the storm. Still about 1 million people at one point were without power, still a couple 100,000 without power as I speak, more than a day, more than about 2 days after the storm really blew through the region. Still quite a bit in the way of cleanup left behind. That said, I kind of want to transition over to a bit more of what kind of I experienced and what it was like covering the storm. Obviously, I was a 9 News meteorologist and working at 9 News, living in Denver, in my case, for 12 plus years. Covering hurricanes is not something I'm used to doing or something I have a ton of experience doing either. But I will say, and we'll show some of the pictures as we go here, the main studio in Tampa, WTSP, is in St. Petersburg. If you've ever been to Tampa, St. Petersburg, that area, St. Petersburg sits on a little bit of a peninsula. And where the station is, WTSP is, it's really in a very vulnerable part of the Pinellas County Peninsula, the St. Petersburg area peninsula. It's in the Zone A area, which means it's the first place that gets evacuated in the event of not even a hurricane, a tropical storm, any sort of big windstorm. They'll evacuate that area because where WTSP, our sister station here at 9 News' studio is located, it's in a very vulnerable area. It's less than a half mile from the water, from Tampa Bay. In fact, behind the studio is a little creek as well that tends to flood. And so they're from two different angles where the studio is. They're very, very concerned about storm surge. So as soon as this storm became a threat, they started making plans to send us to a backup studio, which is actually very close to where our hotel is, about 5 minutes, 10 minutes drive from where I'm sitting right now on the northeast side of Tampa. It's a couple miles inland away from the water, which means, the saying with a hurricane, you may have heard this if you're from a hurricane-prone area, it's hide from the wind, run from the water. And that's in reference to the fact that water, even though we tend to focus about winds, there's often a lot of discussion about wind. Really what tends to kill or lead to the most casualties, it's water, it's storm surge, that wall of water that comes in as a result of really strong winds. Winds kind of blow up some of that water and press it on shore, and that tends to be the leading cause of death in a major hurricane like this one. So that's why part A of this is that we had to get evacuated from our main studio, as mentioned, in St. Petersburg, and we ended up having to go to Tampa, which is, again, we're just exactly where the studio is. It's a bit more inland. The airport, if you've ever been, Tampa's right on the water. Downtown Tampa's right on the water. That's not in a great area, but there are parts of the city that are a bit further inland. That's where our backup studio is. Now, speaking of our backup studio, again, we'll show you some of the pictures as we go along here. The studio itself, I found it to be quite okay. It was quite this is what was striking to me, and something we don't experience in Denver, is that the station goes through multiple hurricane preparedness drills a year. So they've done this before, and it was very clear. soon as we got there were 30 cots all set up throughout the newsroom, throughout the entire station, and that's where I ended up sleeping for a night too. It was very clear that they've A, been through this before, and B, they rehearse this possible situation all the time here. Again, there were cots waiting for us uh, more than a day before the storm arrived. There were boxes of food. They had brought in Olive Garden and Chick-fil-A and an enormous amount of non-perishable snacks. They actually brought it back to the main studio today because they had so much overbought food that they just had to bring it back to the station and it will slowly be consumed there. But it was very clear to me that they were very prepared for the situation, for the possibility that if this storm had directly hit us, of the possibility of us having to camp out essentially in that studio for a week or more. They were clearly prepared for that. And again, we had cots, pillows, everything set up inside there. And so it was a unique experience. I mean, in Denver, we'll have the occasional snowstorm that might be big enough that we have to maybe spend one night. And that would be a storm of the century kind of thing, maybe a 3-foot snowstorm. You might not be able to get out and get to a hotel. In Tampa, this is something that is a possibility a bit more often. Just any big hurricane that's bearing down on this region, you have the potential that you'll be without power or trees will block your roadway to get out of there. And that means that you're going to be stuck at the station for perhaps a prolonged period. So that was one part of my experience as well, was having to stay at the station. And then on a additionally kind of positive note was being on air in a market that I've been to Tampa once or twice before, but I wasn't particularly familiar with. Was also quite interesting having to learn some of those nuanced little names, Zephyr Hills, some of the specific names that we think about Colorado, for example, Saguache, the way it's pronounced is a bit different. Lyman, certain places that we all have in different places, different parts of the country, you have to learn their pronunciations. That was a bit of a test drill for me as well. So I guess there were quite a bit of takeaways, but I think in Tampa, St. Petersburg, from a broad perspective, I think the overwhelming sentiment and feeling was one of kind of a gratefulness, a gratuity of the fact that the storm didn't really directly lead to widespread devastation. It was more of a nuisance storm in Tampa and St. Petersburg. Things were closed. Power was and still is out, and that can be obviously more than a nuisance at times, especially if it's over a prolonged period. But it's been fairly cool since the storm, at least for Florida standards. Today's highs, for example, in the upper 70s. And the reason I mention that is that after a storm, if you don't have power, and you don't have here in Florida, if it's 95 and you don't have power and you don't have air conditioning, that can lead to even death, heat-related death. You're talking about part of the country that's exceedingly hot, and if you're without air conditioning, it can be deadly here in this part of the country. And fortunately, temperatures have been fairly cool after the storm, and so those without power, while I'm sure it's not particularly pleasant, it is not most likely a life or death kind of situation. So I would say that the overall sentiment here in Tampa, from both the station in terms of the fact that it was handled pretty well there, and the fact that the storm didn't lead to crippling impacts for the immediate Tampa St. Petersburg area, although obviously thinking about our friends a bit further south, there's a bit of a feeling of looking at Fort Myers and Cape Coral and thinking that could have been us here in Tampa, and being grateful that we have a home to go back to, or in the case of the people who work here, that they have homes to go back to. In my case, I have a upstanding hotel, and things will get back to normal here pretty quickly. While we know that won't be the case for friends in Fort Myers and Cape Coral and Punta Gorda and Port Charlotte, where the cleanup effort will not be weeks, it won't be months, it'll probably be perhaps years in some cases in that part of the country, kind of like a Marshall Fire kind of situation in that part of the country, where again, the Marshall Fire, again, not something that takes weeks or months to clean up from. It'll ultimately take years to clean up from the Marshall Fire. Same situation in Southwest Florida from Hurricane Ian. But I will say also as well that on a personal note, it was a privilege, obviously keeping in mind the devastation that impacted parts of Florida, but it was a privilege to come down here and lend my expertise and to help, hopefully, um, some of the people stay safe during this highly impactful storm. So those were some of my takeaways I thought would be good to share, especially for our friends here in Colorado. I'll be flying back this weekend, so I'll be back and sharing more of my story in 9 News throughout the course of the coming week. And so hopefully this has been a bit of insight as to what I went through during Hurricane Ian. Again, I will say I didn't personally see anything that bad. The winds were pretty strong at times, but it could have obviously been a lot worse for us. And I think we're all pretty grateful that we didn't end up with anything like what they ended up with in Fort Myers and Cape Coral. Anyways, that was my takeaway, and I thought I would share it with you. And thanks so much for joining in. Hopefully this has been insightful for you. And again, I'll be back this upcoming week, the first week of October, with more insight here on 9 News Plus and also on 9